There's a lot going on in France. There has been for quite some time. We've had the Gilets jaunes or yellow vest movement going on for many months now. There were elections last year for the European Parliament. There is now a nationwide series of strikes taking place. We have many developments, a lot of them having to do with the policies of the government of Emmanuel Macron. Here to join us now to talk about all of this and its implications is Cole Stangler. Cole has been on the program before. He is a journalist we always enjoy speaking with. He's based in Paris. He has been published in The Nation, in Jacobin, The Atlantic, all sorts of places. The Guardian continues to be, and he's been covering all of these developments, and he joins us now from Paris. So first of all, Cole, thanks for coming back on the program.
Thanks so much for having me again, Richard.
It's always a pleasure. And listen, at this moment, as we pre-record the show, we're still in the midst of a nationwide strike, as I understand it, in France. And what's going on there? How's that going? Who's involved?
So we've just seen the fourth national day of strikes, nationwide strikes. It's now into the 36th day since the strikes began. So going back to December 5th, day of action on the 10th, the 17th, and then the 9th is the most recent day of action. So these series of rolling strikes across the transit system combined with these national protests and strikes, which we just saw the fourth day. This is over the government's plan to overhaul the country's pension system, Emmanuel Macron's pension reform, something that he's wanted to do since before being elected. He wrote about it in his book when he was running for office called Revolution before that 2017 election. And since becoming president, this has been one of the major reforms that he's been hoping to implement. And the government has finally now moving to the phase where they're pushing ahead with this reform. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the proposal that they've put forward is very controversial. And really not just controversial, I should say, but actually opposed by the majority of the population. And so the movement that we've seen unleashed is in response to this pension overhaul that the government's proposed.
So here's what I wanted to ask you, Cole Stangler, about Macron's proposed changes to the French pension system. And bearing in my own history, I used to be a social insurance consultant and advisor, policy person. I like to think I'm not an idiot about this stuff, although there are those who would disagree. But I tried to look at Macron's pension proposal with is sort of an unbiased eye to begin with, just to see what he might be driving at. Here's what I got, but maybe you can help me. I got, first of all, that he wants to consolidate all the different pensions negotiated by, whatever it is, 40 plus different unions and so on, into one plan. Then you get to this part where I'm trying to think of even how to express it. Instead of working towards, you'll know your pension is likely to be X when and he's raising the age from 62 to 64 in many cases. But when you get to what would I get when I retire, right? Which is what every worker, most workers want to know. It's basically, well, you'll get these points, and these points will be worth this, and then you go to that, and your points get converted. And so me thinking of myself as Mr. Expert, I walked away thinking I would have no idea if I was a French worker what I would get at retirement, but I would know one thing for sure, which is it ain't up to me. It's not up to my union. It's going to be up to somebody somewhere who's shuffling numbers. It's felt like a three-card Monty. Is that unfair?
No, I think you've touched on some of the more controversial parts of the reform. There really are three things that are really sparking a lot of the unrest here in opposition. One is, as you alluded to, this plan to create a so-called universal system. France right now has 42 different pension schemes that exist. Some of those are applying to large groups of workers. There's a big private sector pension scheme that affects a lot of workers, millions. There's a big general civil servant one, a public sector one. Then there are smaller ones that cover just the rail workers, the national rail workers, to all the way to the Paris Metro. Even the opera workers in Paris have their own pension system. And so Macron wants to get rid of all that and merge them into one system. So just on that alone, you've already upset people that are covered by systems that are relatively generous. That would be more generous than what the universal system would be. So when you look at workers that are in the national rail system, for example, they would lose. You look at the metro workers, they would lose. More importantly, civil servants clearly are going to lose out from this reform, from losing their special system. That's one big thing. Another point about it, as you mentioned, is this so-called point system, which sounds kind of wonky, but to make it more concrete, it really strikes at the core of what the French Social Security model has been since the war, really, since liberation in 1945, when the major social democratic state was unveiled in France. Right now in France, when you pay into your retirement system, you get a certain portion of your paycheck that's getting deducted, as in the U.S., to pay to retirement. The employer is also contributing, and then at the end of your career, you're getting benefits that are based off of, if you're in the private sector, it's the best 25 years of your career. If you're in the public sector, for most private sector workers, I should say, there are exceptions if you have a special system. For most workers, it's the last 25 years of your career. You get a pension calculated on that. For the public sector, it's the last 6 months of your career. Macron's reform would essentially get rid of all that and make it into a much more individualized system where each individual worker is essentially accumulating points throughout their career. And that it's a wonky point, but it kind of strikes at the core of this model of France's so-called solidaristic social security model. And then the third controversial point, the most controversial point, and this is a little easier to understand, is that the government is essentially proposing to hike the earliest possible age at which retirees can begin collecting full pension benefits. And right now that's at 62 for most private sector workers. The government wants to make that 64. And those are the 3 points. And that last element about hiking the earliest age from 62 to 64 is also interesting, because one of the more moderate unions in France has said that that's the one point that they're not willing to swallow. They've already said that they support the universal system, and the government has not been willing to budge even on that more minor point of the hiking of the retirement age, which really shows you it's emblematic of their attitude here. They want to go ahead of this reform, and they don't seem really intent on making concessions, at least not very serious ones.
No, and by they, of course, you mean the Macron government.
Yes.
And again, we're talking with a journalist called Stangler, who is based in Paris. So a couple of things. One is I haven't seen an economic analysis of raising the retirement age in France, but I know that in the United States there have been analyses of, for example, raising the Social Security retirement age or eligibility age in this country, which has already been done, but doing it again. And it gets to be, over the course of a person's remaining lifetime, a significant benefit cut. Each year is several percentage points off your total benefits. So it's a non-trivial adjustment or change that Macron wants to make there. And the only other thing I would say, I guess, about the point system, Cole, but I'd be curious to know what you've heard, what you know about this, is that it seemed to me that the points were going to be assigned based somehow on the overall state of the economy in some way, which struck me as meaning that the investor class, financial class, will reap the benefits of a booming economy and workers will do okay. But if the investor class, I may be completely off base about this, but if the investor class screws up, as they did in 2008, and ruins the economy, workers will have to pay the price for the mistakes of others that they had no control over, because the points will be worth less. Is there any truth to that, or what do we know about that?
There's a lot of speculation about what the point system will actually look like in concrete terms, and it's important to say as well, the government actually hasn't introduced the final piece of legislation. This is all based off of proposals, which is why we haven't had a more rigorous mathematical study based on concretely how this would affect each subset of workers. So there has been a lot of talk about certain parts of French society and investors benefiting from overhaul to the system, namely BlackRock. There's been a lot of controversy over that, the investment fund, which is supposedly been favorable to a pension reform in France, and that's been cited by a lot of critics and protesters as a reason to oppose the reforms. But I think another point that's also really worth highlighting here when you talk about the impact of the French economy on retirees is that right now, it's very easy, and there's certainly no shortage of publications that do it. I think of an outlet like The Economist, among others, which will regularly make fun of France's supposedly archaic, overgenerous social safety net. And they like to make fun of the fact that France has all these retirement regimes and it's so complicated and there's all this red tape, et cetera. But if you actually look at France's retirement system in practice, this is a system that has helped make France be a country where you have the lowest rate of retirees at risk of poverty across the European Union. It's the country that has the lowest such rate across the European Union. That's pensioners at risk of poverty. It's a little bit over 7%, I believe, which is about half the EU average, much less than Germany, much less than the UK, which are two states that are often upheld as being the models towards which France should aspire to. And if France were ever to throw off all the red tape and the pro-worker rules that are inhibiting the economy from really growing. And another point, again, about the economy as well, is that the pension system and France's social spending net, social spending and safety net is actually very helpful when the economy starts to sour. And this is another point that critics of the reforms have raised, is that right now, as the global economy starts to slow down, and certainly there's no shortage of warning signs, the safety net is very helpful in these kinds of moments. If you look back to the Great Recession and the sovereign debt crisis in Europe, France performed relatively better than a lot of its neighbors in the European Union, in large part because of its generous safety net and its social spending. So I think it's another point that's not worth forgetting.
Yeah, it's a really important point as an economic stabilizer. And again, we're talking with Paris-based journalist Cole Stangler. Let's talk about the politics of this for a second. If my memory serves me well, Emmanuel Macron became the head of the French government after a round of elections. It seems to me in the first round it was divided. There was Marine Le Pen. There were left candidates. Socialists didn't do well, but Mélenchon did a little better. Then anyway, it wound up between Macron and Marine Le Pen, the far-right candidate. Macron won. He's got a strong showing in Parliament, but how badly has he been damaged, either personally in terms of his popularity and his standing, and that of his party through all these conflicts? The year of 2019 with the Yellow Vests, these strikes now. How is Macron doing politically?
Yeah, Macron's popularity has slipped since he was first elected. It was never very, very high, but it slipped, really bottomed out during the Yellow Vest crisis and the Yellow Vest movement. It's risen a little bit since then, but still, if I'm not mistaken, the more recent numbers are lower than 40%. It depends on what poll you're looking at, but we're still talking about a president that has, in general, lower than 40% approval ratings. You can pick out different polls that show different things, some around 30%, depending on the kinds of question you're asking. But overall, pretty clearly less than a majority of the population supports Emmanuel Macron today. If you look at polling over the pension reforms, the majority of the population is opposed to the pension reforms. The majority of the population also supports the strike movement, which is, I think, pretty impressive as well when you think about all the disruptions that it's caused to people's lives, especially here in Paris, where you have the transit system that's essentially ground to a halt. You have very limited service, makes things very complicated. The fact that in spite of all that, people still support the strike movement, oppose the reforms, I think is pretty telling. And Macron's popularity has been pretty weak. I think a really important part of understanding Macron and the opposition he faces in France today is to recognize that it's a point that I always make, is that Emmanuel Macron was never elected with the full backing of everyone who voted for him. Emmanuel Macron won in 2017 against Marine Le Pen because he was not Marine Le Pen. That was the main reason why people voted for him. And the problem is that Emmanuel Macron has taken that mandate in 2017, which he won by a pretty comfortable margin because of his opponent, and translated that into essentially a carte blanche to implement all of his very controversial reforms that have been long supported by the business lobby and much of the French right wing. When we talk about reforms like the retirement reform, when you talk about overhauling labor law to remove worker protections, you think about the rail system. A lot of critics saying that those rail reforms are going to lay the groundwork for privatization of the SNCF, the national rail system. You think about unemployment insurance reform, another reform that the government just completed before retirement reform. This is a change in the law that essentially enhances government scrutiny of those receiving unemployment benefits, similar to the model that exists in Germany. At least that's the path that the government intends to go on. All of these reforms, very controversial, not very popular, and yet we haven't really seen the government back down on its desire to quote unquote reform this carte blanche that Macron seems to think he has, and that's where you get into why Macron has this image of being arrogant. It's why during the Yellow Vest protest, we saw people calling on the president to resign, which sounds silly and ridiculous, but Macron is really the face of a lot of people's frustrations. And there's a sense that he doesn't care what the population thinks. And I think the latest manifestation of this is this strike movement we're seeing right now. When you see hundreds of thousands of people coming out on the streets on January 9th, Thursday the 9th, we saw 500,000 people, just under 500,000 people coming out in the streets across the country, according to the police. When you see this happening on a regular basis and the government isn't willing to budge at all, it makes people lose faith in the democratic process, and it makes people very angry towards the government. And so I think the kind of political situation that we're moving to in France is a very uncertain one. Macron may be the president right now. He may have a big majority in parliament right now, but if you look at the actual polling, what people think, it's a lot tighter than that.
Well, Cole Stangler, it seems to me that, first of all, he's got the power. He's exercising it pretty ruthlessly, pretty forcefully anyway, if people object to the word ruthlessly. Emmanuel Macron, he's got an agenda. He intends to carry it out. And it seems to me, from here anyway, that there is no viable left alternative to him at this point. So in some ways, it seems to me a little bit parallel to what we've seen in the United States over certain decades, where you have ideas that are normally considered left, whether it's stronger unions or a higher minimum wage or Social Security expansion or Medicare for all, whatever, that you have certain ideas that are actually popular, pretty popular across the political spectrum, but within the political system, France used to have a fairly active left. People had their frustrations with them. Socialist Party ruled for many years and so on, off and on. It seems to me now that there's Marine Le Pen on the right. There's Macron from the global financial center, quote unquote, or whatever you want to call it. And there is, on the left, just kind of a scattering of parties. The left didn't do well in the European Parliament elections last year. I don't see any political figure on the front stage, or for that matter, any political party saying, the socialist tribe, discredited. I don't see any political party or figure out there saying, well, this is how we fight for you, the French worker, and this is how we restore the working person's state to, what it means to the French people. I just don't see that. So it feels like, what's the alternative?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you. I think you and millions of others of French people would agree with that. There is not really an alternative, sadly, right now. You have Marine Le Pen on the far right, and she is increasingly, and her party in recent years have moved more into criticizing the center on economic issues, So the National Front talks a big game these days about the National Rally, as they've since rebranded, talks a big game about protecting French industry, about protecting French workers, and if not necessarily in actual policy proposals, at least rhetorically, talks a lot about sticking up for regular French people and the safety net on economic terms. But you're absolutely right. When you look at the left, there's really not any one figure right now that's emerged, or any one party. To the contrary, you have really too many parties that exist right now. Dozens of small little organizations that represent ultimately little, although some bigger than others, that they kind of compose the French left today, but no one figure. And we'll have to see what happens with the presidential elections that are coming up in 2022. But really before then, I suspect there will be some sort of recomposition. Right now, people are looking towards the municipal elections in March of 2020. So March, get used to saying 2020 now, in March. So coming up pretty shortly here, that we might see the left or left-wing parties perform better there. But I think what's interesting about, just take a step back about this moment that we're seeing now, is if the government, even if the government doesn't pull back this retirement reform, and I think it's unlikely at this point that I've been surprised before, but I think it's unlikely that the government's going to, as protesters are calling for, simply withdraw this pension reform. They have far too much invested in it to do that. But even if the government is able to get their way, Macron is able to get his way with this controversial pension reform, this unpopular pension reform, I think one of the effects that this is producing, this and these other reforms, is I think making things clear to average voters, which is to say, I think it's really consolidating different blocks, or at least paving the groundwork for maybe the consolidation of different political blocks in France. You have on the far right Marine Le Pen and her reliable base of kind of faux economic populism mixed with really nasty, mean, race baiting, and basically criticism of Muslims and really nasty far right stuff. You have the Macron base of this kind of, we're going to reform France to make it friendlier for business while also being socially liberal. You have that block, and then on the other side here, you have, I think, maybe the left, which has political space in front of it. The question is, how do you give that? How do you translate that into an actual party, into organization, into electoral coalitions, and into power? Because right now, if you're opposed to retirement reform and you happen to be not wanting to blame immigrants or Islam for the problems in your life, then you don't really have a political option that's on the table. That's the space that the left should be occupying, and that space is still there. The question is, who is going to fill it?
Well, yes, of course, that's a question. I totally agree. And I guess what I worry about, Cole Stangler, is we're seeing the far right do a lot better because of this global vacuum, it seems to me, in a left alternative. So, for example, you have the outcome in Austria, right? The recent outcome where the Christian Conservative Party gets elected with maybe its most socially conservative anyway leader in a long time, who's coming back for a second run as prime minister, going into a coalition with the Greens, who are not the runner-up party, but the third party, but did much better than they had. So now you have this experiment going on in Austria, where a conservative party that did run on, anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant rhetoric is in a coalition with the Greens, whose rhetoric is pro-feminist, pro-immigrant, pro-diversity, and they actually had to negotiate, as I'm sure you know, in their platform, well, we're only going to ban the hijab for girls under 14. That kind of thing. It's like, so what I worry about for France, and I would be delighted to hear I'm wrong, but what I worry, at the AfD doing better than expected in Germany and so on, I worry that Marine Le Pen's faux economic populism, if it's the only economic populism on the plate, that she's going to exceed expectations and that we may be in for. I'm not personally a fan of Macron's or his parties, but that we may be in for an unexpectedly rough ride from the right in France. Am I worrying too much?
No, I think it's certainly a fear that a lot of people have. We saw in 2017 when Macron was elected, there was graffiti that was saying Macron 2017, Le Pen 2022, alluding to the next presidential election. And Marine Le Pen will probably be there. If not, then someone from her party. I think if you look at polling, one reassuring point is that if Emmanuel Macron is extremely unpopular today, so is Marine Le Pen. So is, frankly, just about any important political figure in France today is not very popular. So there's still a lot of antagonism towards Marine Le Pen. And there's been a lot of speculation about whether or not the party has a glass ceiling, so to speak, is the phrase that's used here. Is there a point at which really they've kind of maxed out on all the voters that they can attract? They have their kind of core base where they really mix together these two, roughly speaking, populations, which is a more well-off, middle-class, older population that tends to be in the south of France, that doesn't like having all the immigrants around. That portion with these kind of disaffected working class voters that either were voting for the left or not voting at all. And that's the kind of block they built today. And the question is whether they can really go further. I think one key indicator will be how they do in these municipal elections in March. But again, to answer your question more directly, I think it'd be really surprising at this point if Marine Le Pen was in a real place to compete in 2022, just based on how much people dislike her. What I think is what we could say is that it would be surprising to me also if you had the same matchup in 2022, Macron versus Le Pen. It'd be very surprising to me if Macron had the same score that he did then. I think he would almost certainly have his score go down, because what basically happened is that you have people, left-leaning voters, people like me, really, who, when you have this option, you basically say, all right, I don't have much of a choice. Let's go out and vote for Macron because I don't want to be living in a fascist country. And that's the calculation that lots of left-leaning people made. But even in the most recent race, talking to lots of people, a lot of people didn't want to vote, or almost didn't want to vote, because they just felt like Macron was so contrary to their own values. And I think the amount of people that might not turn up at the polls, I think, is much higher in 2022. Especially when you see these reforms that have just been foisted on the French population without popular backing. I think that turnout score won't be as high. Again, this is all very, very speculative in 2022. But to get back to the crux of the problem, there really isn't an alternative right now on the left. Although the space does exist.
Millions of people in France, many of them intelligent and left-leaning, and not a single one is out there. The hundreds of organizations and dozens of political parties. It's just, it's frustrating. But on the other hand, it's not dissimilar to what we've experienced in this country, including the fact that our last presidential election was a contest between the two most unpopular presidential candidates since they started measuring such things. So I don't want to end on a down note, Cole Stangler, of Macronism into the sunset, into the foreseeable future. You mentioned the municipal elections coming up. What are the expectations there? I mean, in certain parts of the world, cities, municipalities are the engines sometimes of change, of positive change. Is there anything interesting that could potentially happen there?
Yes, absolutely. I think we're going to see Macron's party maybe take a beating is a little bit strong, but they're not going to do well. And they're certainly not going to come anywhere close to the kind of hegemony they have on the national level. In a number of cities that they hope to win, I don't think they're going to win. Here in Paris, the Macron camp, the left is far more used to doing this, but it's actually the Macron camp this time that is split into two rival candidates, which is paving the way for potentially the socialist mayor of Paris to get reelected. If you look at a city like Marseille, the second biggest city in France, En Marche, Macron's political party, isn't really competitive there. Instead, there's been a much more exciting development for left-leaning people, which is that the parties of the left are actually uniting together and running a common candidate. So the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, and La France Insoumise, France Unbowed, the movement led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who was the biggest vote getter in the 2017 election from the left. Those three parties are joining together in an electoral coalition in Marseille, which is France's second biggest city, and they have a real chance, I think, to win that election. You have in Toulouse, another city that's currently governed by the right, that the left, I think, while there hasn't been the kind of unity achieved at this point, there's a clear progressive left-leaning base there that I think could swing the city to the left. And you look at other big cities in France that are governed right now by the socialists or by left coalitions. I think those coalitions have a good chance of holding on to power. If you look at a place like Rennes in Brittany, if you look at a place like Nantes, again in the west of France, if you look at Montpellier in the south, these are all left strongholds that, despite the pretensions of Emmanuel Macron to overhaul and to transform French society with his agenda, I think the En Marche, his party, is not going to do particularly well because, again, this is a party that represents a minority of French people. It happens to be in power right now, but it certainly doesn't represent the majority of the population. And these municipal elections, I think, are really going to show it.
Well, my friend, you're in an interesting place at an interesting time. And for a journalist, that's a great place to be. So Cole Stangler, a journalist based in Paris, writes for a number of publications, including The Nation, The Guardian, Jacobin, and so on. Thanks for your great reporting on what's going on there in France. And thanks for coming back on the show and updating us.
Thank you so much for having me, as always.